Now, today and the first class after the spring break, we're going to talk about Hegel. Why are we talking about Hegel? Well, towards the end of class, when we talk about social justice and all that, economic justice, we are going to inevitably talk about Marx, and I don't think it is possible to even understand Marx without understanding Hegel. How many of you guys curious about Marx? Okay, a couple of people. Well, even if you're not curious, I'm sure you heard of him. People talk about Marx all the time. Some people swear at him and say he's horrible. Some people, on the other hand, adore him. Some people maybe are more neutral. But either way, you'll hear more. And I don't think it's possible to talk about, especially modern ethics, without mentioning him. Because Marx's ideas are extremely influential, whether you like him or not, and you need to know him. And like I said, it's practically impossible to understand him properly without understanding Hegel. And Hegel is quite amazing in his own right. He is very influential everywhere in all different sciences. And so we will talk more about him. Today we'll start with Phenomenology of Spirit, which is his first work. But before we do, since Hegel is really reacting to Kant, let's again look at the Kant and refresh our memory. So what was going on with Kant? His thing in itself, his epistemology, what was it about? Do you remember? Yes?
It's the object without like human interaction or like without the human's interpretation of the object.
Yes, one good way to think about it, the way I think about it, suppose that without glasses we couldn't see anything, right? But in order to see something, we need to put on glasses. However, glasses in some way distort the picture. And that would be kind of the way to think of Kant's approach to all the objects, the way our mind sees the object. So our mind, the object is real. He's not saying, even though it is considered type of idealism, but he's not saying that objects are not real, that this is all a phantom of our imagination. Nonetheless, he is saying that they only provide matter of experience. What would be the matter of experience? Well, all this visual feed, the senses giving us what we hear, and so on. All of this is basically electromagnetic impulses, right, which go through our nerves straight into our brain. But then what does our brain do to it? It actually applies certain categories on it, and that is what gives form to our experience. It puts this dough of experience into a certain form. And remember that two of the most important contributions of the mind to reality, according to Kant, is time and space. Time is how we perceive reality within our mind. We only can perceive things consecutive, in consequence, one after another. And space, on the other hand, is how we perceive objects outside of our mind. We cannot perceive anything without the spatial dimensions. Even if you're blind, you still can touch things, and you can only imagine them to be multidimensional. If they have no dimension, you will not perceive them. So that's two of the things, but there are several other things, such as all those categories of understanding, quantity, quality, and so on. Causality. The very fact that one thing causes the other. And this empirical eye, the way we perceive ourselves, again, is obviously in time and space, and so that would also be here. But if we could, and we can't, but if we could perceive an object all by itself, the way it truly is, That would be thing in itself. Now, starting from epistemology, starting from the questions of how do we know, what do we know, he moves towards metaphysics because when he starts calling that nominal reality, noumena, and especially when he places here, remember, human freedom, God, soul, and the real I, which we can call ego, transcendental ego as he calls it, that of course already metaphysics. Even though he says that metaphysics can be seen as the phantom of our imagination, we are just projecting things which we cannot know, but nonetheless he says, well, this is regulative concept. We need them. We need them to function. And what happens if we do not have them? Well, you could see that with Nietzsche, for example. The Stoics already had something like that. In other words, the idea that we cannot change the world at all. The world, including us, is just the way it is. All you can do is either like it or not like it. And you better like it, because if you don't like it, then that doesn't change anything. You're just going to be sad all the time and upset about everything. Well, it does seem to be, on one hand, somewhat intuitively right, but at the same time, there's something wrong with it too, because that completely takes away our freedom, and it seems like then we cannot meaningfully blame anybody for any wrong action. We can't evaluate anything. And we all have this feeling that we actually can. We can change our life. We can act differently. Other people can act differently. And if they don't, that's their fault. That means we can blame them for it. So that is, I guess, his attempt of solving it. In phenomenal world, everything follows those laws of science. Here we have strict laws. Everything is determined. There's no freedom. But the nominal world, the world in itself, is solves it. And then he also uses pure reason, remember, as we talked about last time, for his ethics. He's saying we can use the pure reason itself to figure out how we should live. And what does he say about that? How should we live? According to what? What law is there for us to do it so that it could become a universal law? Remember, so that everybody, if you would feel like everybody should do it the same way. So just ask yourself, do I want it to become a universal law? Do I want everybody to do that? And if your answer is yes, then do it. And if your answer is no, then don't do it. This is the, like I said, most important part of last lecture. And remember, you will need to also incorporate it into your paper for the presentations and for the course paper, because you need to look at everything from several standpoints. If you go back there, utilitarianism, Kant's philosophy, then natural law philosophy, which we'll cover next after we talk about Hegel, and Aristotelian virtue ethics. So you will have to look at it from all those points of view. You may as well learn it now, although I guess sometimes you have to just do it right before the paper is due, but it's better to do it ahead of time. So that's his categorical imperative. It has two other formulations. What's his second formulation? And he says it is the same idea, but in different words. So what's the second one? Treat others and the ends and not means. Exactly. That's his second. And then you should be autonomous lawmaker. In other words, your reason is making the law. That's the idea of freedom here, right? We do have freedom. We actually can act in a variety of different ways. But this is how we should act in order for us to be truly free. Because if we don't, then of course we are not using our reason to guide ourselves. We are being carried away by passions or whatever else, in which case we are slaves. We are not truly free people. We only are free if we legislate ourselves and command ourselves to act in a particular way. But how should we do it? Well, in this way. This is the categorical imperative we should be using. And remember his antinomies. What were his antinomies? Yeah. Does the universe have a beginning in time, or does it not have a beginning in time? Both answers seem reasonable. If you think about it, on one hand, shouldn't the world have a beginning in time? How could there be not beginning in time? On the other hand, how could it have a beginning in time? What does it mean? What was before that? There has to be something before that. And yes, in terms of space, is there a smallest particle? Well, on one hand, there gotta be. How can we infinitely divide everything? If we got an atom and we divide it in half, what are these halves? Half atoms? What about the half atoms? Can we divide them again? And modern physics tells us there are strings. Well, great. Can we divide the strings? No, why not? There has to be half a string or something. What are the strings made of? It seems like you should be able to infinitely divide, but at the same time, if you infinitely divide everything, that doesn't make any sense either. I mean, so there's like literally no smallest element whatsoever. The only thing you cannot divide is 0. So is everything 0? And that seems to be an antinomy. The reason seemed to contradict itself, so the Kant's answer to this was this. The reason just hits its limit. It's trying to think about things which are more of a thing in itself type of material. And just like this outdated computer which you try to upload the modern version of the software on, it gives you an error message. It tells you, can't go there. That's what happens to our mind when the mind is trying to approach these things. Okay, so hopefully we are refreshed on Kant, and now we can talk a little bit about Hegel. This is his painting. Unfortunately, he died before photography, so there are no pictures of him. But the paintings do exist, and this is towards the end of his life. He's not a very good-looking guy, I guess, but nonetheless, he was very smart guy. He certainly was one of the smartest people ever alive, and his philosophy is extremely interesting. So let's talk about his biography a little bit. Also gives us better understanding of who he is. Born in Stuttgart in southern Germany in 1770. So that would be just shortly before Kant released his first Critique of Pure Reason. He was a teenager when Kant released it, but then he actually took advantage of the state-sponsored education. The way it worked back then in Germany is in a way similar to what we have today. You could go to university, but you had to pay for it. There are ways to get free education, but they are few and limited. Hegel's family did not have much money, so he actually had to take one of those free opportunities. And the free opportunity was if you want to become priest, because the state actually wanted more priests. They liked to have more priests. They thought priests are there to keep people in order so they wouldn't rebel and so on. And so they were happily providing free education as long as you enter a religious path. And this is what he did. He entered Protestant Theological Seminary at the University of Tübingen in 1788, 18-year-old. And even though, interestingly enough, the conditions there were that obviously they wanted you to become priest, that's why they were paying for your education. But by the time he was graduating, there were already so many priests that they started giving people an opportunity to pull out of it. If you don't want to be a priest, you don't have to be a priest. So even though he got this theological education, he eventually was able to get out of it and not become a priest, and the state didn't insist on him doing that. So kind of found a back door to get education for free and yet not to do something he didn't like. However, it still does tell us a lot about him, because Still, education was religious. He studied Bible very deeply. He was an expert on Bible. And a lot of his ideas are closely related to religion, although whether or not he actually is himself can be considered Christian or not is a huge debate. You can look at his philosophy in different ways. You can interpret it as being friendly to Christianity and being anti-Christian too. Okay, so then for a few years he was private tutor to a wealthy family. Lots of educated people at the time, if they didn't have much money, did that. It was very difficult to become professor at the university. Well, kind of like the way it is today too, because trust me, not everybody who gets PhD becomes a professor. that field is very competitive. And so he did this private tutoring for a while, was teaching somebody's children. Then actually in 1801, his body got a position of chair, Schelling, by a position of chair of philosophy at the University of Jena, and they were corresponding, and Schelling said, hey, you want to come over and teach kind of part-time? And Hegel said, yeah, sure. So he moved to Jena. He became kind of a, what you may say in today's terms, part-time professor, which is basically not getting a salary, but paid by students, per student. If he is able to get some students into his lectures, he gets money per student. So he was doing it for a few years, and that's when he actually completed the Phenomenology of Spirit. Phenomenology of Spirit is an amazing book. We'll talk more about it next time. Hopefully you can do the reading. But that was his first major work. Prior to that, a lot of people in Germany looked at him like just a follower of Schelling. Schelling actually became very, very well known even before that. Whereas Hegel was virtually unknown, and everybody thought he was just a little disciple of Schelling. Even when he published Phenomenology, at first it didn't have much of interest, didn't receive much attention. It's only later when people discovered that it is an amazing book. But it did have quite an important legacy. Well, just around the time actually when he published it, the armies of Napoleon occupied this part of Germany. I don't know if you guys know history of the time. It's actually quite interesting. So Napoleon was moving further and further east. He was, his armies were occupying first Germany, then he would move all the way to Russia, where he finally will have his butt kicked. But nonetheless, at that point, they were doing pretty well. And just as Hegel was finishing the book, the artillery was already firing, and there were those French soldiers shooting. So it was quite a tumultuous time. As a result, they shut down the university. Once they took over the town of Jena, they shut down the university completely. He lost his job. So then he became newspaper editor for a few years. He was editor of the newspaper. Then he became what you may call today school principal. They gave him a position not in the university, but in gymnasium in Nuremberg, which is basically a high school. And he was in charge of the school, was teaching his philosophy to students. Don't know how much they liked it, but he had an opportunity, so he used it. Then he published The Science of Logic. The Science of Logic actually is the first work which did get huge recognition. At that point of time, he was already 46 years old, which is close to retirement, and still virtually unknown. But that book finally made him famous, and this is when he finally started getting offers to get a chair of professorship, which he accepted. First, the Heidelberg University. Once he accepted Heidelberg, the University of Berlin, which just started at the time, it was a brand new university, also felt a little bit jealous and made him an even better offer and said, hey, come here. So he moved to the University of Berlin, and he was teaching there starting from 1818. Published several more books, but his students adored him and kept all the lectures, the notes for all of his lectures, which later on were also published as several additional books. So eventually he did triumph. In fact, his philosophy became very, very influential in Germany. I don't remember if I told you when we were talking about Schopenhauer, but there was a funny accident with the Schopenhauer too. Schopenhauer, at the same time as Hegel was at the University of Berlin, Schopenhauer also decided to be professor of philosophy, came to Berlin to give lectures. And he was not an established professor, so they also allowed him to teach part-time as kind of what Hegel did many years before that, and be paid per student. Schopenhauer hated Hegel, and he decided to schedule his lectures at the same time as Hegel's lectures, just to spite him. Guess what happened? Nobody came. He didn't get a single student. Everybody went to listen to Hegel. So he got so mad that he dropped the entire thing and never taught again. Well, fortunately for Schopenhauer, he actually was very wealthy. He got huge inheritance after his father died, and his father died when he was a teenager, and he never had to work for the rest of his life. So it was pretty easy for him to say, yeah, I'm never going to teach again. For Hegel, of course, that was a source of livelihood, plus at that time he already had a family, he had wife and children. And he was extremely popular, extremely successful. Unfortunately, 1831, there was a cholera epidemic in Berlin. Whether he died actually from cholera or not is a little bit hard to say because it was so long ago. Obviously, they didn't do an autopsy back then or anything like this. It seems like he did because right when the cholera struck, and it was kind of like the pandemic we had, right? They actually told professors that they don't have to teach. They can go to a countryside or whatever. But he continued. He stayed in Berlin, continued teaching, and then suddenly got sick and died within a few days. So that was probably the result of cholera. He was still fairly healthy. He actually wanted to rework the entire phenomenology. We don't know what ideas did he have, how he would have changed it, but that put an end to it, so we will never know. So that's his life. Now, phenomenology itself, like I said, published 1807. It's the first presentation of his original position. It's a weird book. It's an extremely weird book. If you just grab it off the shelf and try to read it, you'll be immediately confused. And part of it is deliberate. Now, the preface is notoriously obscure, and the reason is this. He says it right away himself. He says, I know students frequently just read introduction and the conclusion because they don't want to read the whole book. Well, that's not going to happen here. You can't understand this book unless you do the work. You have to read the entire book, and then he starts talking about things in his philosophy which sound like complete gibberish to anybody who doesn't understand him, so you'll get tired after 2 pages and probably going to drop it. Almost everything in the book is difficult, but at the same time, once you understand it, once you get deeper to what he's trying to do and how he's doing it, you will understand that this is truly an amazing book. And it kind of is entryway to his system. That's the way he looked at it, at least initially. To get to his system, you have to do the work, you have to read this book, and then that book will tell you what you need to know. So he starts just like Kant. The basic idea is this Kantian idea of how do we approach the object, even pre-Kantian, right, epistemological idea. How does mind able to understand the object if all the mind has access to our own ideas? It's the fairly old debate in philosophy. Locke was also talking about that. I mean, all we have access, direct access to is ideas. I don't have direct access to this bottle. How do I know there is a bottle on the table? So this is the Kant solution, right? He said that there is certain matter of experience and we impose the form of experience. But Hegel actually kind of looks at the whole thing in a very different way. He disagrees with Kant almost about everything. We will, after the break, talk about how he changes ethics, Kant's ethics. But to begin, he does change this Kantian epistemology. So he says that the whole thing is misplaced. The mind gives its own criterion to understand whether or not the concept is adequate. And if it's not adequate, then we do run into certain problems, and these problems then will manifest itself in our life. We will not be happy, to put it very bluntly. So there are different ways to view reality. Each way to view reality, you may say what he calls it form of life. There's always a certain form of life in existence. The way we live today, our culture, society, and so on, that's the form of life. But every form of life is also moves through different stages when it can run into contradictions. We can pretty much begin anywhere. We don't need to have a specific point to start thinking about it, because life itself provides the criterion. So consciousness provides its own criterion within itself, so that the investigation becomes a comparison of consciousness with itself. In other words, if your view of the world is inadequate, if you do not have the correct understanding of reality, reality will push back. You will feel that there is a problem. You will not be happy, to put it in other words, right? So inadequate conception of knowledge will eventually fail according to its own standards. You will see that your understanding of reality is inadequate. But despite this disillusionment, we will find pointers to a new or more adequate knowledge. So if the form of life is outdated, that form of life is no longer good enough, but then another form of life appears. And just to jump a little bit ahead, that process we call history. Because it happens on the level of society just as it happens on the level of a person. So how is the mind related to reality? The epistemologists, including Descartes before Kant and Kant itself, made this distinction between contents of the mind and the object. But to Hegel, that distinction itself is misplaced, because the object is part of the mind, and the mind is part of the object. Right? So that's basically the same thing. And this is what is the idea, which is why his approach is also idealistic. Where is the source of error? The source of error in that distinction which our understanding makes to begin with. We turn to think of things as either this or that, either finite or infinite, either one thing or many things, either free or associated, either thing or a thing in itself. Now, that actually is the wrong way to think about it. And things are both and. They are this and that at the same time. Now, let's go back to the three doors. You remember this example? We talked about Stoics. So this is kind of an illustration of what he means here. Your life is an infinite choice, right? You get it facing these three doors all the time, and there is, according to Hegel, always the correct door and not a correct door. And if you're going through the wrong door, you will encounter problems, and that tells you that the form of life is wrong. Your job is to find the correct door, which always is there. The reality is inherently rational. Reality does have rationality inside of it. That's the internal dialectic. The distinction between beliefs and their objects arises solely within the mind. We continually move from conceptions that turned out to be simplistic and inadequate to ones that are more comprehensive and coherent. So, just to explain it in terms of this reality, right? If you think this is the way reality is, that would be a mistake, because the real reality is here. But once you encounter problems in life, you can adjust your view of the world. And then your view of the world will move, let's say, here, which is closer to reality. You will still have problems, but not as many. Then you can further change it here. Then you can further change it here. So you slowly will then be moving towards reality, and your mind will know, because there'll be fewer and fewer problems, fewer and fewer, less and less resistance that life provides. And this is literally how things are happening within history, because the reality doesn't change immediately, it changes through history, right? So the way ancient Greeks looked at the world was one, the medievals looked differently, and so on. And this is what happens with what he called spirit. Spirit is just the sum of all the minds, but it's bigger than the sum of all the minds. So what about Kant's antinomies? Well, he says that actually is quite normal way for our mind to work, and that is what dialectic method is, dialectics. Things are both and. They both have beginning in time and do not have beginning in time. They both have basic elements and don't have basic elements. Now, the mind, the way mind works, it likes this kind of fixed determinations. It thinks about one specific way reality is. But that's a mistake, because reality is never like this. So every time you do that, another type of reality will emerge which will contradict it. Actually, it's not the correct Hegelian way, but it's very helpful to understand the way Marx understood it. So the way to think about it is, Hegelian scholars usually hate it, but nonetheless, you may have heard it. Thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So first you have a thesis. Now every time you have a thesis, there is something which will contradict it, and that would be antithesis. Once that happens, you will find a solution by combining them into a synthesis. Now synthesis then becomes your thesis, which again will encounter another antithesis, and so on. So that is the dialectic process, and according to Hegel, it's not the way Kant thought that your mind sends you a message, error message, that you are not doing something right. It's the opposite. That actually is how the mind works. That's a normal process of comprehension. So that would be the dialectic. Comes from the Greek word. Remember that what Socrates was doing, the conversation, or kind of conflict and opposition of some ideas. And that is the way your mind works and the way society works. This is basically at the foundation of reality. Our ideas always develop in conflict and opposition. Now, it's not as straightforward as this, which is why, like I said, Hegel never said it, and his scholars don't like it, but this is the way Marx was thinking about it, and it's just a simplified way. For Hegel, it's just a little bit more complicated. So the idea can contain absurdity within itself. The idea itself contradicts itself. Or, in some cases, idea is found to be incomplete. Something's missing from the idea. You need to add something. Or sometimes two complementary ideas found to presuppose a third idea. They don't work unless the third idea is added. And the point always is the ideas are always one-sided and inadequate. You cannot possibly have a complete full idea, but anytime you have an idea, that idea will have some flaw. And then there's nothing wrong with it because it will just lead you towards a better idea. So 3 stages of development of the idea. First, fixed determination, right? We think of it as one thing, like, well, the world must have a beginning. But then the contradiction immediately emerges. Your mind tells you, how can the world have beginning? What could possibly be before this beginning? Like complete nothing, and then out of nothing something happened? That doesn't make any sense. So you see then your mind kind of starts to bring up something else, and your reason eventually will reconcile it, which is to understand that the world could even have a beginning and not have a beginning. Can your mind do this? Let's try it. Let's think about it. Can something have a beginning and not have a beginning at the same time? Think about it. Yeah.
Maybe like a cycle?
Yeah, like exactly. If you look at the circle has a beginning and doesn't have a beginning. It seems like it doesn't have a beginning, but at the same time you can pick a beginning anywhere, right? So that would be one way to think about it. So you can think of it as if we take a universe, you can also think about it indeed as being circular in a sense that just like Nietzsche thought, everything keeps on repeating itself. It's just circles over a certain cycle, never ends. So yeah, you can find a way to do it. And similarly with the smallest particle, according to Hegel, the smallest particle is both a continuum, as in it doesn't have smaller parts, and a smallest part. He called it quantum physics. That's a couple of hundred years before quantum physics, but nonetheless. And his early philosophy especially does sound a little bit strange. But once you get past this strangeness and see how it can be applied to society and real life, you'll see how useful it is. Okay, so he says he calls the concept, or der Begriff, is behind everything. What exactly is concept? Well, concept, der Begriff, in German is the same thing as the Greek word logos. Remember logos? What did logos mean? One of the meanings, yeah. So in other words, it's not just words, but words which have reason, meaning, definition, and so on. So the rational content, that's one of the ways to explain it. And this is essentially what he's talking about. So when, even in the Bible, it says, you know the truth and the truth will set you free, that can actually be explained with his philosophy. What does that mean? Well, first of all, you will find the logos, which is, you can put it the way, the correct door to go through. And if you go through the correct door, remember that is freedom. That's what will make you free. Because being free is just knowing what is rationally necessary. The concept is the same thing as the freedom or rational necessity. Determination of the self by itself. Both can be found within us. When we do know the truth, when we do know the rational necessity, that's when we are truly free. Now, phenomenology itself is kind of a journey. Basically, what he does there, once you get past the preface and introduction, is go through the stages of the way to understand life, like the forms of life. He introduces first the immediate certainty. That's one way that many people looked at it, especially at the time. What does it mean, immediate certainty? It means just simply assuming that what I see right in front of me, that is the reality. It's the simplest way to look at it, right? It's the way most people look at it. There really is a bottle on this table, and the table is here, and I'm here, and I'm standing here. But then he immediately shows you how that falls apart. Because once you start thinking about it, it turns out that it cannot be that simple. Now, to put it in more understandable words is, well, what does that mean for something to be the bottle? Where do we get that word? What does this word mean? What does it mean for something to be the table? What does it mean then for the bottle to be on the table rather than next to the table or within the vicinity of the table? Where do we get these words? Yeah?
In one of the readings from Kant, didn't he say that it was just something that the humans collectively agreed upon? Like they just made it up?
Yeah, but basically that's what it is, right? I mean, we get it from society, right? This is the words we learn as babies. Our parents told them this. Or if it's a foreign language, maybe a little bit later. You can learn it at school or something. But then you have certain words in your own language which you can relate it to. And we take it for granted. But this is a product of society. Society kind of generates these ideas about what is going on, where we are, what is happening. And this is very important to understand because that just tells you that the way we look at the world is the way society looks at the world at this particular time. Everything is very closely related to that. So then he goes through this first stage, rejects it, keeps on going. We're not going to necessarily mention all the stages, but the idea is that this is a different recurrent views of life: sensuous and intellectual, emotional and reflective, practical and theoretical, mystic and philistine, skeptical and dogmatic, empirical and speculative, conservative and radical, selfish and social, religious and secular. And one of the reasons why he didn't want to preview it by saying in the introduction what he's doing is because he wants you to actually understand how it's all happening. He gives you an idea, and then he shows you how it collapses. And it doesn't collapse completely. It leads you to a different idea, which in turn also collapses, but again doesn't collapse, but leads you to yet another idea. So that's kind of the way the book progresses. Those different forms of life, they all seem like such givens. And we all understand how it works. You have a view of life. You think this is the view. This is the true view of reality. The way we all look at reality right now is probably how we all feel about it. Like, we are so certain about it. But then time passes and we see that there are problems with it. And these problems can grow to the point when we really have to reject it and find a different way to view reality. Now, whose mind is it? Who are we even talking about here? There are three ways to look at it. One of them is this within the mind of philosopher, right? Because when we read the book, we do this work within our own mind. It's happening within our own mind. We're following what Hegel was writing, and he also did it while he was writing himself. But that's only one of the three ways to look at it. The other way to look at it is your own life. That is what happens in your own life. Like literally from childhood to death. You have a certain view of life as a child, which then changes. Then you have a different view of life, the way it is probably now, when you're grown up but still very young. Then when you grow older, that changes too. Then it may change again. So we kind of again go through this, each one of us. But most importantly, for our purposes, is the journey of the human species, because it's happening in isolation. So this is one of the biggest disagreements he has with Kant, because Kant noted that both his epistemology and his ethics are very individualistic. It looks at it like you have suddenly this 30-year-old man or something popping out of nowhere who legislating himself and using his reason. Wait a minute, where did that come from? Did he just was he just pulled out of the womb 30-year-old man with all these ideas and understanding of himself or herself? No. He was a tiny little baby, and his or her ideas changed throughout life, and they were evolving. So to Hegel, this mind is definitely a social mind. It's connected to all the other people, not only the ones who live now, but the ones who lived before us for generations and generations and generations. So if you look at it, and from that point of view, not each one of us, but all of the people who live in a certain part of the world at a certain time have the same glasses, you may say, right? But people who live in a different country may have different glasses. And people who lived 100 years ago had different glasses, and people who had lived before them had different glasses too. So they all looked at reality differently. So that disagreement between the reality as it is and our idea of reality is historical. It's connected closely to history. It's been developing from the very beginning of time. And since certainty, this first position, like I said, basically does collapse, then we go into second stage, universalization. And I want to describe them because that's just going to get unnecessarily technical. Then understanding, that's the third one. Here's a good quote from that part. It turns out that behind the so-called curtain, which is supposed to hide what is inner, there is nothing to be seen if we ourselves do not go behind it. And one can see something behind the curtain only if there is something behind the curtain to be seen. So what is he talking about here? What is the curtain? Well, the true reality which we are trying to understand, the thing in itself. So in a similar way, funny enough, there is a lot of similarity with Schopenhauer. He thinks that the way Kant looked at it is in a way correct, but wrong, because the thing in itself is not found to be outside of our mind. It is part of our mind, just like everything else is part of our mind. The entire reality is part of our mind, and our mind is the reality. Now, self-consciousness is actually where we will see this separation from Kant. And the reading will be very helpful for this, which is why I want you to do the reading first. It is difficult, because again, his language there is very obscure. But just try to go through it. Just push yourself to go through the entire reading. It's not ginormous, and there is a lot of time. So I do want you to try to do this reading, and then you will see when I explain it, what exactly is he talking about. Maybe you can understand it yourself. I don't know. I actually had students who understood it themselves, or maybe you can cheat and like Google it. But hopefully you're just going to try at least and understand it yourself, and then we will talk about it in class. This specific part, the reading which they put for you guys to read, impressed Marx the most. So it actually is also a good introduction of the Marxist thought. Just as a preview, Marx actually accepted the entire Hegel, but he famously said that he put him from the head onto his feet. He thought Hegel was standing upside down. He had to be turned around. What it means exactly, we'll see later, but that's essentially what is happening. He turns Hegel around. Whether it's from his feet to his head or from his head to his feet, that's debatable. I would say that Hegel is closer to it than Marx, but nonetheless, Marx is basing his entire philosophy, you may say, on Hegel. Okay, so the idea that the whole thing is purely historical at the time was fairly new, and since then this is really how we look at it. Phenomenology could be viewed as one large thought experiment that shows the mind can move from inadequate conception of reality to more adequate ones. But Hegel actually believes that is what happened in history. This is what happened to humanity as humanity was moving from these early stages when we were barely understanding who we are, right? You can look at it this way. At one point, we were pretty much animals. Do animals understand who they are? No. I'm pretty sure my cat has no idea she's a cat. She probably doesn't know what it is to be a cat. She probably thinks I'm a cat too, because I mean, seriously, who else can I be? So at one point, humans were like this too. They were just running around, like, I don't know, hunting bisons, doing whatever. Then they started to be more self-conscious. Obviously, the first language started to emerge. Then it started to be more complicated. And this process continues. It's not finished yet. We're getting better and better idea who we are. But is this an interesting question? Do we want to know who we are? Do we know who we are? Do you think it's already answered? You're not sure? Who are we? What are we doing here? Yeah, is it important though? Do we care?
Some people do.
Some people do. Should we care?
I don't think everyone should care.
You don't think everyone? You think some people shouldn't?
Some people should care.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's whatever they're doing.
Well, it's in a sense what Nietzsche thought, right? He thought that if we truly know who we are, we'd be so terrified we won't be able to live anymore. But some of us can handle it. Only very few. Well, I think I'm a little more optimistic on that subject. I think that, first of all, it's not that bad. There's no reason to think that if we truly understand who we are, we'll just commit suicide or something. Second, I think that we can and we probably should understand who we are, and we are really far away from it. We are still very confused on that subject. And it is the most important question, because that's what you can say we're here for. If there's any reason, and it seems like there has to be a reason, because I mean the idea that the whole thing is just completely pointless, well, I don't know about you guys, but it really rubs me the wrong way. But this whole thing, this amazing world which we enter, it's all just nothing, just big nonsense. There's got to be something more to it than that. Right? No, you don't think there's anything more to it? Well, I am, like I said, more optimistic, and Hegel was more optimistic. And Marx was more optimistic. So some philosophers are more optimistic about it. And they think that we actually can do better. This is what Hegel thought is going to happen, and this is what Marx thought should happen. Eventually, we should do better. And if you look at
It was the Nietzsche perspective that is like pointless. Is that his perspective, Nietzsche's?
Nietzsche? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Nietzsche looked at it this way, remember? He looked at it like, it's really terrible, horrible, but you have to accept it. So the hard part is to understand that this is horrible, and to accept it at the same time. So he did kind of borrow it from Schopenhauer, who thought it was horrible, but you have to fight against it by suppressing the desires. Nietzsche thought, no, it's horrible, but you have to embrace the desires. You have to embrace this horror, every pain and every suffering. You have to enjoy it, and then you'll be an overman. So that's the Nietzschean idea. And note that for both of them, like, you really can't change it now. It will be happening. We don't have any control over it whatsoever. Hegel, in this sense, is a lot more optimistic. He actually thinks that we can change it, and we should change it, and we can do better, and we should do better, and he even thinks that we will do better. It's just a matter of very long time. If you look at the history of the world, again, some people are rather pessimistic. They're saying, did we even achieve anything? Well, what do you guys think? Did we achieve anything in the past, I don't know, 5,000, 10,000 years?
Yes.
Yeah, we definitely achieved a lot. People were just, indeed, just like Hobbes said, living these brutal lives. They would be either eaten by other animals or slaughtered. They were cold all the time. They were suffering. At the very least now, we have some relatively comfortable life. At least many of us. Not everybody. I'm sure there's still people in Africa and so on who live in really horribly. But we can do better. We can help out others to live better life, especially if we're not too selfish and don't deport them all the time. But that's the struggle, right? The struggle, the idea is that we should do better. We can do better and we should do better. And Hegel thought that eventually, and Marx thought that eventually we will do better. How Marx thought it was going to happen, we'll see later. Hegel thought that at least looking at the spirit itself, the spirit should definitely achieve higher degree of understanding of reality, which will then remove the contradictions, at least to, well, it's hard to say. One other thing scholars debate about, did he think we can completely remove the contradiction and achieve the state which is perfect? Or is it just kind of a goal which you can never get to, but asymptotically you can only move closer and closer and closer towards? It seems like Hegel is kind of, on many subjects, can be read in different ways. So this is the historicism. This is the way Marx also was looking at it. The crucial feature of Hegel's philosophy. Ideas, not eternal objects, but are products of our time. The ideas we have today is a product of our time. The ideas people had 200 years ago were a product of their time. Trying to think of them the way we think about ourselves is wrong. So, for example, at the time when founding fathers started this country, there was slavery, right? And founding fathers themselves had slaves. Well, can we blame them for them? Not from the modern point of view, because they are not our contemporaries. They had different ideas at the time. They were revolutionary for their time because they recognized that there's a problem with that. But we can't immediately blame them and say, oh, you thought there was a problem, then you should have freed all the slaves. Why didn't you free all the slaves? Well, the spirit at the time was not there yet. That's not how people lived. And similarly with the oppression of women and many other things. We live in our time, we have different ideas, they are better than their ideas, we have better concept of reality, that's why we think differently than they did. But at the same time, you have to recognize that the spirit in each point of time is only as good as it is. The truth of any idea cannot be understood apart from its origin and the role in historical settings. So you cannot just really pull out even Hegelian ideas outside of the fact that it was happening at the beginning of the 19th century, the way Germany was at the time, the way Europe was at the time, which is why I also always like to give these historical introductions, because sometimes you can teach philosophy without any history whatsoever, just give these ideas, and that will be very anachronistic and it will be hard to understand why did they think the way they did. So the entire history of philosophy from the point of view of Hegel is just the story of spirit, the way spirit was developing through history. Philosophy is the way we looked at ourselves in all those different times, starting from ancient Greeks and then medievals and so on. And this is dialectical development because the philosophers came up with their ideas, but they were never perfect too, right? There were problems with their ideas. Then somebody later came up with better ideas, resolved those problems, but they had their own problems, and so on and so forth, including today. The way we look at reality today is not perfect. It's much better than before, but it's still not perfect. So that would be normal process of dialectic development. Whether we can finally reach this absolute knowledge, which is the goal, like I said, hard to say. Can we ever know the reality exactly as it is in itself? Maybe not. But at least we can get closer and closer and closer to it, and that would be the goal. The goal of philosophy is the point where knowledge no longer needs to go beyond itself, where knowledge finds itself, where concept corresponds to object, and object to the concept. So that's the goal, and even if you can't reach it, you definitely can get closer to it, as we can see, because it is happening. We are getting better and better idea about reality, even though it's far from perfect. So that's called also coherence theory of truth. Coherence theory of truth is just basically saying that whether or not something is true depends on how well your idea works with your other ideas, your understanding of reality overall. So the only way to understand whether or not something is true is to see at how coherent it is, how well it works for you and for the society overall. So he moves away from the correspondence theory completely, because correspondence theory, the way Kant and philosophers before Kant looked at it, is just too simplistic. To say that it is true that the bottle is on the table if the bottle is on the table, that is too simplistic, because as you can see, we start looking at the things like what is the bottle, what is the table, and we find that it is a product of a collective mind of society which has been created over centuries of time, and unless you fully understand it, you don't know what you're talking about. It's very, very simplistic to say, yes, it's true, end of story, period. So that is Hegel's idealism. Hegel's idealism, he called himself absolute idealist. He called Berkeley and Kant subjective idealists. So they think that the mind subjectively can comprehend reality, but according to Hegel, that's not the case. Only collective mind comprehends reality, so your individual mind is only a small part of this collective mind. And as such, it only understands as much of reality as the entire group of human beings understands at that point of time. It works through culture, through language, through concepts. Everything we think about today, like think about it this way. We have the view of reality right now, right? But how did it shape up? Where did it come from? Mass media, your friends, your parents, newspapers. And that's how you also see yourself, right? That's what shaped out how you see yourself. Who are you? What are you doing here? Well, you are a student. You are getting a degree. That all is part of the current society and very closely connected to this society, cannot be understood apart from it. Apart from it, it makes no sense. It's just there is some animal here sitting on a chair and listening to another animal blah blah blahing for an hour and 15 minutes, right? But once you understand all the other elements of it, you kind of understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. Okay, do objects exist only in our mind then? Is it all imagination? No, he's not a subjective idealist. It's more complicated than that. He actually thinks that the mind is part of reality and reality is part of the mind. So basically, we cannot generate things out of nothing. The things, just like our mind, is part of this bigger whole. And the only thing we do is we change our way of looking at it. So that's the idealist part. We cannot help but doing it. The way we look at reality is always in a way distorted because there's no such thing as true reality. So that would be absolute idealism. The living substance is being, which in truth is subject. So substance is a subject. Remember substance, Aristotle was talking about substance. Several other philosophers tried to understand it. Well, substance, according to Hegel, is subject. It is each one of us. That's what substance is. Rather than objects having their own existence within individual minds, Hegel's absolute idealism claims that the mind is inherent in the objects. So basically, the entire world is the mind. There's an interesting question which we'll come back to later about how does he view God? Because he actually mentions God all the time. And it's interesting too because when he was teaching, there was actually quite a bit of a pushback from authorities against materialism and against atheism. Number of other philosophers lost their position because they were considered to be atheists. Authorities did not like it. Why do you think authorities did not like it? Why would authorities not like atheism? Yeah.
Makes it harder to control people.
Yeah. I mean, there was not a democracy, right? They had those local, I don't remember what they call it, like the kings, because Germany was lots of these municipalities and they had these Kaisers, kings everywhere. And they claimed to have authority from God. The God appointed me. Of course, if people stopped believing in God, people start questioning, why are you commanding us? Who are you? And that is very problematic. So Hegel is deliberately obscure on that subject. When he talks about God, what exactly does he mean? But there is one good answer. To Hegel, God is humanity. It's the sum of all us human beings. That's really what he means when he talks about God. Because there's definitely such thing as humanity. And that is a fact. Now that is something you cannot remove. And that in itself is mysterious, amazing, and that's what has an effect on us and on everything else. So that would be one way to look at it. Okay, so humanity is just petrified unconscious intelligence. The nature is petrified unconscious intelligence. And intelligence is self-conscious part of nature, which is looking at itself and trying to understand what it is, right? Each one of us is part of the nature and at the same time studying nature. Isn't it amazing? Nature studies itself. Well, that's what we are. It's the nature which became self-conscious and figured out, wait a minute, I'm alive, I'm part of it. And what's going on? And so that's why we are here, and that is why it's important for us to understand what's happening. Okay, we have no more time, so let us finish it up for the spring break. Remember, no classes next week. Yay, we have a spring break. This is the reading, Mastery and Servitude. It's there. Try to make sure to read it, and we'll come back to Hegel after the break and see what does it have to do with ethics. How does it teach us, what does he try to teach us about ethics, and what should we do with our lives in more concrete terms. See you guys after the break.